The next speaker is a real treat. I'm speaking for myself. One of my first introductions to cartooning as a little kid was following the New Yorker and being a fan of Charles Addams and Booth and all that stuff. And loving the New Yorker and loving the art in it. And I followed it since the 1960s, probably. And something happened to the New Yorker covers a while back. And something started creeping in. Suddenly there weren't bucolic watercolors of front porches or something. And it started to get this edge. And every once in a while it had not just an edge, but a wallop. And the next speaker is the person that is responsible for that. Françoise Mouly is a Paris-born French artist and designer, best known for her work with Raw, a showcase publication for cutting-edge comic art, and as art editor of The New Yorker, a position she's held since 1993. She is currently the publisher and editorial director of Toon Books. Her book, Blown Covers, was published this year. She is the editor of Houghton Mifflin Harcourt's 2012 Best American Comics, which will be released in October 2012. In 2001, Mouly was named the Chevalier in the Order of Arts and Letters by the French Ministry of Culture and Communication. And in 2011, she was awarded France's highest honor, the Legion d'Honneur. So, Françoise Mouly.
Thank you very much, Matt. I am honored to be here because this is exactly the kind of crowd of people that I admire the most. I surround myself with cartoonists, and I'm really deeply in awe of anybody who has the courage of having an opinion to start with and then expressing it in an artistic form and communicating. And I think that as we drown in more and more images, it becomes even more valuable when individual voices can be heard. I'm starting with a slide of Matt's work because in many ways it represents what I really think is a parallel field of political cartoons, but it highlights what is not on the New Yorker. Most political cartoons will use words and pictures, and things tend to be very clearly labeled. So, for example, in his version of the animal on top of a car here, you have the gas station sign as well as both sides of the elephants, as well as a sticker that says Mitt, as well as a representation of Mitt Romney, as well as the words, the road to the White House, as well as the balloon given to the voice of the elephant. So you have many, many ways that the message is given to you. At the New Yorker, when I came in like nearly 20 years ago, my task was given to me by Tina Brown, the new editor, which was to revive and rethink the New Yorker, but especially what the artist's contribution to the magazine could be. It was founded in 1925 by Harold Ross as a humor magazine. And I think what makes the New Yorker unique is in great part the fact that the artists are full contributors. And by that I don't just mean the ones who do illustrate journalistic pieces or the photographer whose photographs I used also to illustrate the journalism, but the art that we publish on the covers, the cartoons inside, the comic strips that when we send artists like Steve Brodner on assignment, those are ways that the magazine is the sum of its contributors' opinions and thoughts, as opposed to having a preset beat where the editor tells this journalist or that cartoonist what they should do. We do follow the diverse opinion of each of the contributors. When I first came, one of the privileges was to be Saul Steinberg's editor, and I learned so much from him, but he's definitely someone who knew to use words and pictures to make his point, very complex points, very subtle points. And I was talking to Sydney earlier about the provincialism of New Yorkers, he managed to actually create an image that's a very vivid representation of a state of mind. So that's not an easy thing to do. One thing that I remember him saying to me was that what he enjoyed is that when he did a good picture, he actually changed the way people think. So once you've seen this, that becomes a building block of your vocabulary, of the way you think. And you can't remember not knowing about the provincialism of New Yorkers. And you can apply this to Ohio or Washington. It's a pretty universal concept, that limited point of view. It's true, as Matt was saying, that when I came to the New Yorker, it's not a magazine where, as somebody interested in comics and graphics, I hadn't paid that much attention to the New Yorker of the 70s and the 80s and the first couple of years in the 90s, because it had a fairly predictable approach. And this is two covers by Gretchen Dow Simpson. One is from 85, the other one is from 93. But that was the beat that the magazine was going for at the time, to pretty much be timeless and to capture an enduring aesthetics that didn't really tackle what was going on around it. What I had been doing, the Raw magazine, was actually trying to publish the work of cartoonists and graphic artists from Europe, from the US, from Japan, from wherever it went, but to also, in my own way, try to give the voice to the contributors, so that it was, again, it was also a general interest magazine, and it didn't actually try to represent many different point of views. Like this was our graphic magazine for your bomb shelters coffee table at the time where Reagan was a president. And that was a shocking reality for us to contend with. And the works that I was publishing by Sue Crow in the magazine, and I also did like one-shots. This was a book called How to Commit Suicide in South Africa that very clearly had roots in propaganda art and in engaged art, and advocated for boycotting. But that was a tradition of picture making that deals with clear and unambiguous messages. And at the New Yorker, we're not looking for that kind of images. There is a tradition that we have to stay within. The New Yorker has its own DNA, and even though it's been very different incarnation under Harold Ross or William Shawn or Tina Brown, and now the current editor David Remnick, it is a sum of the opinions of its contributors. And there are very few rules at the New Yorker. You could say that it's in essence a cartoon and that we don't use words, but then sometime we'll publish something like this by Ross Chast, which does use a lot of words. This was a commentary on Madoff. You can see Act Now, and this was many different ways that people get lured by the satisfaction guaranteed double your money back offers. So there is not like any set rules about whether the images are from a political point of view or are with or without words. But the one thing that we always have in common is the excellence of the commentary, whether it be long-form journalism or fiction or poetry or humor, and that we assume a sophisticated reader. And we don't have to spell everything out because we can let the reader, it is interactive in that sense. We always estimate the intelligence of our readership. And it's a huge asset for an editor because the joke can be subtle and it is revealed when it's read. So this is from a cartoon by Ross Chast. Here is a cover by Ross Chast. this is funny as long as you know that in August every shrink is away, and New Yorkers are all walking around bereft, except they're also themselves in the Hamptons. But it's not spelled out anywhere in this picture. It's just you have assumptions, and one of the great things with New Yorker covers as well as cartoons as well as often articles, maybe even more with the covers, is that the reader feels like if he doesn't know, he or she should then find out rather than calling the cartoonist an idiot. So when I first came to the New Yorker, I had to go to the library to find out what was the history of that magazine to really understand it better. And what really thrilled me was images from the 30s and 40s, which by the likes of Peter Arno or William Steig or William Cotton or Mary Petty, or the New Yorker has a lot of great women artists actually. And those images were like small stories, very self-contained, that inscribe themselves in a grander histoire de mœurs and give you a sense of how people felt at the time and their prejudices and their opinions. Like both of those examples are from the height of the Depression, but I love the way the artists use the composition and use the color. So there's a Peter Arno on the right with a couple standing in the subway. Is making a magnificent use of that red and white to make that couple stand out, and they ramrod straight, whereas the people behind them are slouched against the columns. And similarly, in his other cover on the left, the bum who is using the cigarette lighter to light up a stub out of the car is drawn with very loose lines that are contrasted to that very angular car. Also, a very sophisticated use of muted colors, of limited palette. There's another couple of images, one by Arno on the left and by Konstantin Alajalov on the right, who's also like a really great cartoonist. So the one on the left is, you know, we're looking at this like many years afterwards, but you can feel the emotion of that nurse. It's like, oh my God, she's holding the baby. And the protectiveness that the nurse have. And you get all of the sense of that. This is the 20s, that liberated woman who hasn't really held her baby that much. And the one on the right, you see this young woman getting married, and she is recoiling from the sight that is framed by the window. Again, the use of space, the use of the monochromatic interior of the car versus the colorful view out the window. This is the Lower East Side with presumably the Italian families. There's a lot of like very offensive ethnic stereotypes in all of that bank of images. It was entirely commonplace and the basis of a lot of humor at the time. But it's fascinating to me how the artist is using the husband as this straight. He's totally oblivious to what she is seeing and how she's curving onto him. This is the images that showed to all the artists that I work with, and I said, like, look, this is a portrait of how people felt and how, you know, the emotions. This is not just what they were wearing and what the cars look like, but this is really what it was like to be alive at that moment and what it felt like to get married in I think this is 1942. And the goal is, as I wanted it with the artists that I was working with, is like, let's try to capture that now, what's happening around us now, so that if the images are looked at 50 years from now, then you'll get some sense of what it was like to be alive in 2012. One of the images that broke that distance that the New Yorker artist had been made to have towards the daily events was an image by my husband, Art Spiegelman, that was his first New Yorker cover, and it was at the time of Valentine's Day in 1993, a picture of a Hasidic Jew kissing a black woman at a time where there had been riots in Crown Heights where people had died. I mean, it was really a horrible, like, bloody internecine fighting between two communities, neither of which were actually New Yorker readers, but both of which got interviewed by reporters who went out there. So what do you think of that New Yorker cover? And it was denounced in the press, in the Washington Post, in the New York Times, everywhere. And a lot of the outrage had to do with the fact that the New Yorker was making a comment on a news event, on something that was happening in our town. But that's one of the letter we got, which came like a week or two afterwards, was from a young girl who said, well, I find it really heartening that on Lincoln's birthday is shown kissing a slave. So it shows that like everybody has their own reading of the images, and this was the sweetest. But the idea then, that's what Tina Brown wanted. She realized she wanted images like this, was to try to engage the reader in a dialogue, in an interactive reading of the images with the artist, to not necessarily to tell you what to think about. This is a period where there were a lot of Calvin Klein ads all over New York City. And this is, to our mind, like a Hawkinson kind of ladies, which is because she's portrayed that way as in the mini covers by Helen Hawkinson. But to actually just point out that those things are happening and to let you as a reader form an opinion. This is an image that came for Back to School in 1993, 6 years before Columbine. Unfortunately, it shows us that this was already in the air. There was already something gravely askew at the time. And again, in typical New Yorker fashion, this gets looked at by all of the proofreaders and copy editors and whatever at the New Yorker, but it is an image by an artist. This is not the New Yorker denouncing this. This is an artist statement in many ways. And so was this image on the right was also another cover by Spiegelman at the time where a street vendor had been shot by New York City cops 41 times. And the mayor at the time was Giuliani. And he actually, there were huge calls for an investigation of how could anybody, the man was not even armed. It actually turns out to have been a case of just cops panicking, but still 41 shots, that seemed that something was gravely wrong between the police and people of color in New York City, and Giuliani's refusal to investigate was what brought this image about. And when it was published, it was denounced by Giuliani, was a mayor. It was denounced by George Pataki, who was a governor. And we had cops picketing in front of the building. And they were off-duty, but off-duty cops actually carry their gun. So it's really scary. So the images were there to provoke a reaction, not necessarily to tell you exactly what you should think, the way a political cartoon or a propaganda image might, but to engage the readership and the artist into saying an opinion and to stating an opinion. And the responses from the reader, every image is a Rorschach test. So this is a cover by Carter Goodrich that we ran around the time of Mother's Day. And I love getting all the letters because we got, hundreds of letters saying like, how dare you say that women should have babies and not work? And then we got hundreds of letters saying, how dare you say that women should work and not have babies? And which was completely the opposite reading. And the image doesn't actually say you should do this or you shouldn't do that. It juxtaposes, it puts next to each other the two women looking at each other, and it doesn't, again, give you a directive. Similarly, this was an image we ran at the time. I give the artist a calendar of like the various themes I tend to suggests that they used seasonal themes, so around June is a good time for wedding. And I remember getting a reader's letters that said, like, how dare you put this on the cover? I have a young teenage girl, and now I've had to hide my copy of the New Yorker because I'm so afraid that she will see this. And fortunately for me, I don't have to answer the letters, but if I had, I would have said to this woman, I've said, well, actually, if you really care so much, if it's so important to you, that your daughter does not get pregnant before she is married, then tape the cover to the room of her, to the door of her room, and then make sure to have a discussion with her. Don't hide it. This is an image that we published in 1994. Now, at the time, that was so outrageous. Some gay couples were actually very happy that we published this. But we were denounced by so many people. Again, on the cover of the New Yorker, it's a sacred place. But later on, I talked to George Chauncey, who is a professor of history at Yale University, and he said he distinctly remembered when this image came out, how it changed all of a sudden. It certainly pleased advocates for gay marriage, but then it also made it possible to even think and advocate for this, because once it's represented, once it's shown, this is a possible direction for it to go. The kind of work that I do with the artists, once there is, this is Jacques de Lustal, a French artist, once there's a basic thumbnail, I still in this day and age, beg artists to send me just a black and white thumbnail fax, because I think what's the rendering I will come later, but I just want a concise idea, and thumbnails are great for that. So this was the thumbnails of two men in front of a wedding cake. And after that, we worked on the various details, including the pink colors that, color has meaning, of course, and also the height of, we wanted to make sure that the man dressed in white wasn't too feminine versus the man dressed in black too masculine. So he worked against stereotype and made the blonde man dressed in white taller with a protective hand over the shoulder of the man dressed in black. It's really interesting to work all of those symbols, and with the artists, and I'm grateful that sometimes we can spend like a month or two working on an image. And sometimes we move much faster. This was an image at the time when Bill Clinton instituted his Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy in the Army, and we published this image by Barry Blitt of two sailors kissing, which of course they're again appealing to the intelligence of the New Yorker reader, but it's of course a parody of the famous Eisenstadt photograph published in Life magazine. And with the reaction, I mean, this is from the New York Post, New Yorker cover of sailors kissing starts another war. Nothing less, a war. Because we had, bomb threats and so on, and many, many protests virtually, like every other cover. But in the interviews, they went out, the journalist for the Post went out and interviewed the man who had been the sailor who had kissed that nurse. And this is a quote from him today. Maybe they do, but that photo belongs to World War II. They ought to keep the gays the hell out of there. Now, what people said back in 93 or 94, 96 is obviously changed a lot, and all those things do evolve. This is something that was sent to me by a producer for NPR. On the right is a photo that was published by the Army this year. So this is 15 years later, after Don't Ask, Don't Tell, gay marriage was legalized in New York City, and that was the cover by Barry Blitt at the time. And I really like having, access to all those different artists that I work with. I'm constantly in a dialogue with them, and it's interesting how their approaches can be very different from each other. So at the time of gay marriage being legalized, I solicited sketches, and this is what Bob Stack had sent to me in a completely different mode, but that didn't pass muster. I have to show everything to my editor David Remnick, and it wasn't. And even though it is a statement of an individual artist and it is signed by him, obviously the editor has to feel comfortable with it, especially since we've published so many images that were decried and protested against, and he has always stood behind them. And the same artist, Bob Stack, each artist can have many different speed. So this is actually the cover about gay marriage that we published by Bob Stack this year, when President Obama voiced his support of gay marriage. And in some ways, it's reminiscent of another cover that Bob Stack had done, which was this one, when Obama was elected, which was a very emotional moment for many of his supporters, myself included. And this became one of the best-selling New Yorker covers of all time. And I think even though this was done very quickly, because again, when on most of the time, like we work on a long canvas, but every once in a while we'll speed things up because there is an event like this that we want to capture while it's happening. I think, like, in many ways, the canvas that we have in place of like working a lot on images, and the artist embed a lot of other meanings. So in that Lincoln Memorial, there is a sense of the Martin Luther King speech. I mean, again, you assume that your readers know those references, and you don't have to spell everything out, which is quite a privilege, again, to have an audience that can actually get the reference. This is an instance where Barry Blitt had an idea at the time when there was Diet Coke and Mentos. Many experiments were going around on YouTube of like dropping Mentos tablets into a bottle of Diet Coke, and then there's a chemical reaction and the thing explodes. So he wanted to do something with it, and the first phrasing of his idea is he had two kids, one kid handing the other a tube of Mentos, then he put it as two businessmen, and eventually the one version of it that works the best was when he put it in two people dressed as Muslims or Arabs. And the reason, I think, I have to wonder why keep trying and why does this work so much better, but I know it's because this one actually makes fun of our own fears. It doesn't just target a simple joke, but it actually emotionally implicates us as the kind of emotion that we go through when we see people dressed in Muslim garb. And here, this is an image that Barry Blitt had submitted at the time when the Catholic Church was being denounced, not just for its abuse that the priests committed on young kids, but also specifically the denunciation was for the hypocrisy and the lack of persecution and for just moving priests from one place to the other. And this was a moment where I had shown the drawing to David Remnick, and it's in all of my dealings with my editors, I'm blessed with having just one editor to talk to, but he happened to be traveling, and he asked me to talk to my colleagues, and then for once, I seldom have to do this, I had to take the drawing around and show it to various other editors. And because I work at the New Yorker, my colleagues are all word people, so they try to like rationalize. They laugh, and then they're trying to understand why they're laughing. So they came back to me afterwards, says, Françoise, you know what, it doesn't work. I said, what do you mean it doesn't work? You laughed. I said, well, the Pope doesn't have anything to do with Marilyn Monroe. And it was hopeless because they had long treaties to explain to me how it didn't work. So it didn't run, and that's how I was able to. I ended up to put it on the cover of the book. I ended up doing this book because there are so many images that I think are marvelous. And like this one was another Barry Blitt trying to tackle the Catholic Church early on. And this is two different phrasing of the same idea. The one on the right it obviously worked best because he was able to put in the words Happy Father's Day and to place occasion for this, the pun, using a greeting card. It's clever because usually you can't write a caption that says this is for Father's Day. This is an image that actually the artist himself, this was Spiegelman, did not pursue, even though this was at the time when George Bush started the bombing in Afghanistan in October of 2001. For Thanksgiving, Spiegelman had done this parody of Norman Rockwell's image, but done with a Muslim family, with a brick crashing through the window, because there were instances of actual attacks against American Muslims. But at the same time, the army started Operation Enduring Freedom, which consisted of dropping on Afghan towns both cluster bombs and care packages, to the confusion of local kids. We would rush over to the packages and then it'd explode because it was a cluster bomb. So that's what Art decided to do, and that's the cover that ran for Thanksgiving, the one on the upper left. But using the icons of the ethnic stereotype is really difficult. This is an image that we run in 1993 after the first bombings. There was a trial of the suspect in that first bombing, and I was really shaken because my kid was 3-year-old at the time, my older daughter, and she was right next to the World Trade Center, and I had to rush over when I heard that there had been a bomb attack. And that again talked to me, this image by David Mazzucchelli talked about the fears that we all live through when there's a terrorist attempt in your daily life. And I had thought about it in terms of blaming all Muslims or whatever, but it had to do with actually isolating like Islamic fanatics or radicals, and we had work things out with a kid that has red hair and with a Semitic-looking kid who is just as much a victim of that kid was jumping. And we were denounced by the Muslim Anti-Discrimination League and made to sit in a meeting and told that you can't use like stereotypes, and how many Muslims do you have on staff? Well, it wasn't that many at the time, and that's why we were so insensitive. But again, I was asked not to respond, but still, you can't make this kind of image without the caife. Like if it's just some angry kid jumping on the sandcastle, the image loses its entire meaning, which had to do about a group of religious fanatics. Right after September 11th, we were able to run this image which does use actually a Sikh, which has nothing to do with Muslim, as I hope you all know. But, it's taxi drivers in New York were all terrified of the reaction to that event. Then this is an image that didn't run and by Zohar Lazar. And to me, this is like a really interesting image. And again, every cover or would-be cover is a Rorschach test, because it uses here what cartoonists call the reaction shots. This woman was actually doing a double take of like, whoa, what's that? And you can't see what she's thinking because she's wearing a burqa. But still, you are her. A reaction shot actually brings you into the picture where you are like, you ask, how do you feel about this? And is this a denunciation of American cultural imperialism that sends out, women soldiers in Muslim countries, which can be deeply offensive for people of Muslim culture, or is this an endorsement of the liberation of like gays in the army or women in the army? It has all of those complex meanings and can be read in many ways. This is just a wall of my office when something happens and I solicit many, many artists and I ask them to send me their sketches. So this was right after there was a tsunami in Japan, and I got like images from so many different artists. Everybody actually is grateful of the artists who respond are grateful for the opportunity to actually say something on paper. And again, I ask them to send quick sketches, and often they'll come up. This is a cover of The Economist. That's the same idea as a sketch that had been sent by Bob Stack. It often happens that artists will have very similar ideas. Many of them were using here the red circle for the Japanese flag. But one artist, Christoph Niemann, had sent those radiation flowers and was already paying attention to the radiation, which became, the man-made disaster became the more memorable even than the tsunami itself. And then there's this image, which some of you may have seen, which was in, actually in the spring of 2008. I really was asking artists to try to do images about the innuendos, about what people were saying. And this is the sketch that Barry Blitz sent. At the time, his first draft had both Michelle and Barack as Muslim, and it had Ann Coulter and Rush Limbaugh and all of the right-wing pundits outside the window looking aghast. Again, their reaction shot. And in talking with Barry, refining the image, and Osama bin Laden on the wall, and refining the image, he ended up adding like an American flag burning in the chimney, turning Michelle into the caricature of the way she was being represented as an Angela Davis with an AK-47, and taking out the people in the window, because that was in a way too facile to attribute that vilification to just a couple of people, as if this wasn't like as a society. I mean, this was a subtext of much of what was discussed at the time. The reaction was insanely violent. In the age of the internet, as Barry Blitz pointed out, like, is Sailors Kissing also got a big reaction, but people had to write letters. And it's very different if you have to compose the letters and if you just can take an email and go, and then send hit, which is most of what we got. But we got like something like 30,000 emails and phone calls and so on and so forth. And it was quite intense. And everybody kept saying, I get it, I understand, but I worry about my mother-in-law, and I worry about people in Arkansas who are not going to get it, and I worry, as they all worried about somebody else, you know, which I think told us how well targeted the image was. And this was the best response. That was the cover of Entertainment Weekly. The image was actually discussed in the New York Times as one of the most influential image of 2008. Fortunately for me, like when talking to Blit or to my editor Remnick, they both insist that like no cartoon will ever change anything, so that's good. This is part of the discussion that I have. So, for example, I was in the middle of talking with Bob Stack at the time. This was Michigan primaries, and every pundit was predicting that. Who was it? Santorum. That Santorum was going to win, and therefore Romney would be in the doghouse. So on Monday or Tuesday, while the voting was taking place, he sent me a sketch on the left. And then it turned out that Romney won. But that Romney won that primary, or they won it neck and neck, so there wasn't a big Santorum loss. So I was talking to Barry and saying, like, well, I have this sketch by Bob, but you know, I don't think I can use it because the reality didn't match, and Barry very generously said, well, tell him to switch, which he did, and of course that worked out really well. And Gail Collins really liked this image. She just wouldn't stop. And this is an image that's interesting to me. This is at the time when Giuliani was mayor. So it was by Harry Bliss on an idea by Bob Sikoryak. And it was, again, representing somebody's prejudices. This is difficult images to make and to do. But when I put this book together of blown covers that were never run, my daughter, I asked her to do something to publicize it on that interweb thing. So she did a Tumblr and started this thing that's really interesting to me, which is she started a weekly contest on those themes. And when she had posted that image that was about Giuliani, it went viral. It actually just went on like hundreds of blogs, mostly from what she could figure out from black people, African Americans, which is interesting because as far as they were concerned, this was around the time of Trayvon Martin, and things had not changed from the early 90s to now. And this is the kind of images that were sent by artists or cartoonists who have sent mock New Yorker covers to that blown cover blog around the theme of Trayvon Martin. And it's just, this is almost a dream come true because now we can actually like have more than one New Yorker cover a week because there's also those mock New Yorker covers. This is the image we ended up publishing when Obamacare was held constitutional. But talk about working at the last minute. I had been told by all the political writers for the magazine and my editor that all we knew was that the decision on Obamacare by the Supreme Court this year was being written by Judge Roberts, but I'd been told that they were convinced that it was going to be a disaster for Obama, and therefore they had me solicit sketches by artists because this was going to be read at 10 a.m. on a Thursday, and we go to press on Thursday night, so we didn't have time to prepare the image in advance. So this was an image by Christoph Niemann, again on the assignment of this Supreme Court has killed Obamacare. This was Barry Blitt on, I love sketches, as you can see. So this was sketched by Blitt by Judge Roberts bringing down his gavel on, and you as a patient. And again, I love the dialogue between the artist's images, because here you as a patient on the operating table. This was Christoph Niemann again with that large gavel getting a reflex out of poor Obama patient. And this was a stack about justice, finding the Obama patient in his hospital room. This was again by Niemann. I got like 20 or 30 sketches, but this is like a few to show you like many different artists have different ideas. But Obama with his hands tied by Christoph Niemann. This was Blitt again with Obama taking his medicine. He sent me a couple different versions with different amounts of Alka-Seltzer and Zantac, and we were discussing which antidepressant would be the right ones to have in this image. And then this was what Bob Stack sent. And I thought that was great. I mean, it was simple, it was to the point, it showed the Supreme Court. But I waited until they read the decision. So they read the decision, and then all of a sudden we and everybody else found out that like actually Judge Robert upheld it. So within literally 15 minutes, this is what Bob Stack sent. I don't think I can top that, so I'll leave you with that as the last slide.